Okay, ich freue mich, dass ich Ihnen den nächsten Vortragenden vorstellen kann, Karl Monsma. Karl Monsma ist Professor für Soziologie aus Brasilien. Er ist Gastwissenschaftler hier bei uns am Institut für ein Jahr. Seine Arbeitsschwerpunkte sind die Themen Auswanderung aus Deutschland nach Brasilien im 19. Jahrhundert, außerdem rassistische und ethnische Gewalt. Und das sind auch genau die Sachen, zu denen er heute Abend zu uns sprechen wird und Ihnen einen kleinen Ausschnitt seiner Expertise vorstellen wird. Ich sage Ihnen nur ganz kurz noch, dass im vergangenen Jahr ein Buch von Karl Monsma erschienen ist, das ich hoffentlich richtig übersetze mit dem Titel Die Reproduktion des Rassismus, Bauern, Schwarze und Immigranten im Osten São Paulos im späten 19. Jahrhundert. Karl Monsma, wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag.
Thank you, Philip. I apologize for speaking in English, but I'm sure that if I tried to do it in German, it would be even harder to understand. This is the book, by the way. It has a picture on the cover which is interesting because it shows former slaves and European immigrants working side by side, which is much of the book is about the relations between them. That's not really what I'm going to talk about today. I'm talking about more of the background to this based on one chapter of the book about slave rebellion in the period before the abolition of slavery. And this is where I'm going, the context and then what was happening with the growing rebelliousness in the 1870s and the 1880s. Brazil is the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in May of 1888. And then why did this not become a revolution, with a brief comparison with Haiti and some of the consequences. I think it's very important with regard to rebellions that just because a rebellion does not become a revolution does not mean it does not have consequences. Let me say first that São Paulo is going through this boom of coffee production, of ever-expanding agricultural frontier clearing. I mean, this is the destruction of the Atlantic rainforest, essentially, in the late 19th century. In the center of coffee production in Brazil shifts from Rio de Janeiro to São Paulo. And São Paulo is buying slaves from the rest of the country. I should also say for, those of you not familiar with Brazil, is that Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than all of the rest of the Americas put together, of a total of about 10 million people over the course of 4.5 centuries. About 6 million went to Brazil. We went to a rather large country, of course, but and so a place like the U.S. had a very small fraction of the number. And to this day, more than half the population of Brazil is of African descent, or partially of African descent. So you have this growing concentration of slaves from other regions, many of them in São Paulo, and intense work rhythms. Much of the rest of the country, the great majority of the population descended from slaves is already free by the time of final abolition, even in the beginning of the 19th century. Just to give an idea of the work, this is obviously a posed photograph of the slaves on one plantation. This flat area would be the coffee drying court. They'll say a bit more about that. And typically the slave quarters were facing the drying court. So those are probably the quarters behind. This gives some idea of the work. Harvest time is the most intense period, and since Brazil is not really, the São Paulo Plateau in any case, is not high enough for really fine coffee in which the grains are picked one by one. There's fairly marked seasonal difference in São Paulo, so that the fruit ripens at all about the same time, so that what they do is they just take it all off the branch at the same time. There's not this selectivity. So it's more productive, but it's a lower quality coffee, and this is relevant for slavery because it's hard on your hands, and you notice they're working without gloves or any kind of protection. These are mature coffee bushes or trees, and then after they're picked, they are spread out in the sun. São Paulo has this fairly typical tropical or subtropical weather pattern in which during the winter it hardly rains at all for 3 or 4 months, and so it's ideal for drying. If it does rain, they have to get out there fast and gather up the beans. The other aspect of the work that's not shown here is weeding. For harvest period is the most intense period, which is during the winter, well, what would be the summer months here. But the rest of the year, they have to be constantly weeding. Because this was, after all, Atlantic rainforest, and it has remarkable regenerative powers, and vines will choke trees if you leave them for a year. Just to give you an idea of what they're doing, men and women working together, typically, so in the 1870s and 1880s, there's growing rebelliousness. This is partly because there's so many slaves who are bought from other provinces and taken away from their friends and relatives and so on, and thrown into this harsh, demanding work rhythm. Some of them actually had been in urban areas before. But there's other aspect to this. One is the increasing state interference in the relations of masters and enslaved people from about 1850 onwards. In 1850, you have the effective end of this transatlantic slave trade. This means that over time, the number of Africans declines. This is relevant because the Brazilian slave owners had long had a strategy of dividing Africans from the Brazilian-born, giving a little bit of privileges to those who are born in Brazil, giving the harshest work to the Africans, and so on. This is no longer possible. You have greater, and you no longer have these African ethnic and linguistic divisions, which made it difficult for the slaves to work, to rebel together in some cases. Also, because of the declining supply of new slaves from Africa, the prices are increasing for a while, and it means that slave ownership is increasingly concentrated among large property owners. The middle class no longer has slaves, no longer is invested in the system, whereas earlier any small farmer would have 1 or 2 slaves. And we'll have an increase in abolitionism among the white middle class, especially the educated urban middle class. Well, and then you have a few other laws. In 1869, a prohibition of the separation of children from their mothers. So one of the harshest punishments that could be meted out was to sell somebody's children, obviously. And the 1871 Rio Branco law, which is known as the Free Womb Law, which was part of it. Nobody born after that date was to be a slave, although they owed labor services to their masters until they were 20, 21. But it makes clear to everyone that the system is doomed. It's going to end. Although if you calculate, people born up till 1870 or so are still enslaved, you would still have slavery until about the 1930s, if this system of gradual abolition had actually happened. Another very important change in this law is that enslaved people gain the right to buy their freedom. The master has no say in it. They can work on their own, save up money, and then there's an independent jury that evaluates the person, and the master is obligated to accept the money. This is important because it had long been a strategy of Brazilian slave owners to promise liberty in exchange for loyal service. Typically, the day I die, you will be free, provided you serve me well for all this time. More convincing if there's a large age difference between the master and the... and not always respected by... But it was an effective form of control, and you have a constant stream of people being freed in Brazil. So very unlike the situation in the U.S. So you have all of these changes, and everybody knows that the system is going to end, and you start to have a lot of conflict between individual slaves and masters over these new rights. That, I mean, the law has given slaves rights, which for masters is a difficult thing to accept. And they're trying to buy their freedom, and the masters don't accept it. And there's a lot of cases of torture. It's kind of striking to me. I've read a lot of these kind of court cases. How much faith the enslaved people actually put in the law, in the justice system, and so on. And they'll walk for days to go to the nearest police station. The police are always kind of trying to calm things down, send them back. But over the 1880s especially, there are numerous conspiracies and localized revolts. And the police often repress this because they don't want to spread panic among the population, especially the planters. By the end of the 1880s, you have radical white abolitionists from the cities, some of them European immigrants, are circulating in the countryside, stimulating slave revolts. This leads to panic among the planters, and in some cases attempts to organize local militias to prevent people from fleeing or rebelling. There's also the attempt to use conditional emancipation to maintain or regain control. I mean, what this is you make a kind of contract with your slave and say, okay, you will be free 4 years from now, provided that you serve me for the next 4 years. And the usual response to that was, well, okay, and then the next day the slave just kind of took off, left. So it did not work as a means of maintaining control. There was, by 1887, early 1888, there was a mass flight all over the province. Large groups of, sometimes, an entire group like this one, is what, maybe 60, 70 people there, all take off together. Just leave. And there were so many of them that the police just gave up on trying to catch them and return them, as long as they were peaceful. So that the police concentrated their efforts on repressing the attempts at violent rebellion, of which there were quite a few, but they were always localized on specific plantations and neighboring plantations and so on. It was part of the reason why this didn't become a generalized revolution, because the rebellion was always localized. Many planters started to fight with the police. So they would blame the local police commissars for not doing their job, not catching my... at least one of these police commissars was lynched, by the planters. Apparently with the participation of some of the North American immigrants who went there after the Civil War in the U.S. And kind of stimulated this, although it's not entirely clear in the sources. But it's a situation in which, although you don't have large armies of slaves marching on the cities or something like that, which is more of what you had in Haiti, there's a complete loss of planter authority on almost all of the plantations, unless the guy has some kind of personal respect, which is possible, for being a better master than the other ones. And this led to unconditional abolition. There's the abolition decree of May 13, 1888, which is really a means of defusing the situation. The monarchy simply gives up on a strategy of gradual abolition and forces the planters to accept abolition with no compensation. Because they're losing their property after all. They want it to be compensated. Now, why did this not become a revolution like in Haiti? Well, unlike Haiti, the enslaved population, even in São Paulo, was not the majority. The majority of the population was free, and although there was a good deal of sympathy with the rebelling slaves, and a lot of people helped them out, there was also a lot of nervousness about violence and the possibility of racial violence, and something like Haiti, where actually, the rebelling slaves did go around massacring white families. And everybody knew about Haiti. I mean, the revolution in Haiti was, I think, can only be compared to the Cuban Revolution in the kind of fear that spread among Latin American elites. There was also never centralized coordination or leadership in São Paulo. The Haitian Revolution started with some conspiracy that involved several plantations. The rebelliousness in São Paulo did continue after abolition for a while. And this is interesting to note. It didn't stop automatically. There were continued attacks on plantations. Sometimes free Brazilians and even European immigrants joined in, which is the nightmare of the planter elite, is having all these people together against them. But in general, overt rebellion was localized so that the provincial government could send police detachments to disperse them. One of the most striking cases that I came across is of the slaves on one of the most famous plantations, because it was the site of early experiments with German and Swiss immigrants in the late 1840s. But then that didn't work out very well. That led to a rebellion of these immigrants, so they went back to using mainly slaves. Well, it's this large plantation where after abolition, the former slaves simply refused to go away. And they say, well, this is where we grew up, this is our place. And their idea is, okay, we're free, but we're free to continue living here and farming for ourselves. Sort of agrarian reform movement. This continues for a while, but then the police send a detachment, a military detachment to expel them, and then that area becomes subject to a lot of banditry on the roads, and so it's fairly clear that these former slaves who are kicked off the plantations have to find some way of supporting themselves, so they're robbing people going by the roads. So it did not become a general conflagration like in Haiti, but still local elites were very worried. And there were some lynchings to intimidate the black population, not nearly so many as in the U.S., but it's interesting that Brazil, they always claim that there was none, but I did find some. And these lynchings were possible because much of the white population participated, not just the former planters. Even the immigrants participated, and with the tolerance of local authorities, typically. Much of the rebellion was more individual, especially flight, so that after abolition, everybody was free to move about and look for work in any case. The local police did arrest the more problematic individuals or tried to recruit them for military service if they didn't look for work. The problem for elites was how to force all these former slaves to go and seek employment, and not just plant manioc and beans and corn and so on for themselves. In the end, the need to find employment and support oneself or to find land for subsistence farming on the agricultural frontier soon diverted most former slaves from open rebellion. And military conquest of state power was never really a possibility because the rebellion was only concentrated in one province. In the case of Haiti, it took a long time to send soldiers from France to Haiti. In the case of São Paulo, it's right next to, on the train you could get in one day from Rio de Janeiro to São Paulo. And in Haiti, in the end, how did they win? They won with the help of yellow fever, which when Napoleon sent a large military expedition to reconquer the island with the explicit intention of reimposing slavery, the soldiers were all dying of yellow fever. And yellow fever is a kind of thing where if you grow up in a place where it's endemic, you typically have it as a child and you don't die, and then you are immune. São Paulo, it's not endemic. There are epidemics now and then, but everybody has the same degree of vulnerability to the disease. So that was not a factor. Now, briefly, what are the consequences of slave rebellion in São Paulo? Well, the most obvious is freedom. It's abolition, unconditional, immediate abolition, which was never in the plans of the monarchy and much less the slave owners. There's also one thing I find in reading a lot of court cases resulting from violence in this period, a new confidence, assertiveness of the black population, asserting sometimes explicitly citizenship rights, and notions of freedom and citizenship are all kind of up for grabs and being redefined. There's a lot of resentment of former slave owners too, and a good deal of violence against the former slaves, including these lynchings that I mentioned. There's fear and sometimes hatred among the white populations. So this has to do with the reproduction of racism after the end of slavery. And there's also a newfound consensus among elites in favor of support for massive immigration, massive European immigration at that point, to reduce dependency on black labor, to reduce the price of labor, and with the idea that it was mainly Italians, that the Italians would be more subservient and easier to control. It didn't really turn out that way in the end, but at least they thought that. Well, I'm going to stop here. So thank you.